So I'd just like to add my welcome to everybody this morning. It's so good to be here. We begin this series on Esther that will go for 4 weeks. It's such an intriguing story. And there are some very good resources available on the book of Esther. And here is a list of things that you can do to immerse yourself in the book of Esther as we travel through it together for the next 4 weeks. You can read it. It only takes 10 chapters, probably only take you about half an hour. If you're not great at reading, you can listen to it on audio Bibles. HumeRidge has it for about 30 minutes, depending on which version you listen to. The Bible Project has a fantastic summary. It's a visual summary, and you can pop onto YouTube, type in bibleproject.com, Esther, and it'll come up with an overview of the book of Esther. The church has recommended some devotion Bible plans within the YouVersion Bible app. And you can go into YouVersion to plans, and you'll see that HumeRidge Church has recommended some studies for you to do for yourself. If you have children, and the children are in this morning, welcome everybody. We don't mind your noise. I hope you enjoy your colouring in while I talk. Veggie Tales has a great fun cartoon on the book of Esther. If you like animation, you can watch that with your kids or your grandchildren, which is probably what I will do. There's even a movie about Esther called One Night with the King. It's not 100% accurate to the biblical text, but it's a really good movie. And we have written some studies to accompany the messages each week. And some of our life groups will be doing this study during the week, and you can do it also as an individual. If you would like to take some, they're at the info counter. If you don't get one this morning, they'll be available as a PDF on the church website beside the corresponding message. So, why are you here this morning? Why are you here in this place or online watching HumeRidge this morning? Maybe you came for Max's baptism. Hooray, welcome, thank you. It's been such a great morning to celebrate with Max this morning. Maybe your parents have always come to HumeRidge, and so they've brought you, and that's why you're here. Maybe your children love youth church and HR Kids, and they drag you along. I spoke to a friend during the week whose family first came to Margaret Street before we moved out here to HumeRidge because 4WK had talkback radio. Some of you older people may remember. They had a spot talking about religion and life. And this girl's mum would listen to 4WK talkback radio, and she came to church because of what was said on that radio station. However you came here this morning, God knew that you would be here. He has a bigger picture than you and I can see right now. God knows you, and he sees you in all the moments that will come, and he has a plan for your life. There are some things in our lives, however, that we can't control. Some things that end up happening to us that we have never expected. But there are other things that we can control. It appears the heroine of our story this morning, Esther, didn't have much control over the situation in which she found herself in. But God had a long plan for her life. She was a Jewish orphan living in the Persian Empire. She found herself taken into the harem of the most powerful king in the then known world. She gets a free 12-month beauty treatment, and she's paraded before the king in what is essentially a beauty and sex contest. And she becomes queen. She discovers a plan to exterminate the Jews, and she becomes God's vessel to overturn the plan and ensure the continuation of her people in such an amazing and inspiring way. The overarching theme of this little book is that God is faithful to keep his promises and to deliver his people. Esther is the only book in our Bible where the name of God is not mentioned at all. But the work of God is woven throughout the whole story, even though his name is hidden. You see, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. Let me say that again. The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. Esther is proof of that. God promised that the Messiah Jesus would come through the line of David, and the book of Esther shows how far God will go to ensure that his people and his promise are fulfilled. We read the book of Esther as though it happens all in the same week or month, but in fact, it happens over the course of about a decade, in the 5th century BC. Our sermon begins with King Ahasuerus and Queen Vashti. The King James Bible will call him Ahasuerus. Most modern translations call him Xerxes. If you have an amplified Bible, it calls him both, Xerxes and Ahasuerus. I'm going to refer to him as Xerxes today. Xerxes ruled the Persian Empire from 485 to 465 BC. Persia was a world power, and it covered all the land from India to Ethiopia. And you can see the extent of the Persian Empire in green on your screen at the moment. Xerxes was the grandson of King Cyrus, and we read about Cyrus in the book of Daniel, because Cyrus was the king who allowed the children of Israel to begin to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall and the temple. Cyrus had a son, Darius I, and Darius I had a son, Xerxes. During Xerxes' reign, the Persian Empire began to decline because he had a habit of spending too much money. He depleted the royal treasury, trying unsuccessfully to invade Greece, which is what he is known best for throughout history. He continued with his irresponsible spending when he returned home, and our story of Esther gives a snapshot of his exorbitance. The Persian Empire was eventually conquered by Alexander the Great in 334 BC. In our Bibles, in the Old Testament, the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are written all about the same approximate time in history. Ezra and Nehemiah deal with the children of Israel who returned to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall and the temple. And the book of Esther is about the Jews who remained where they were in the Persian Empire. The book of Esther also explains the origins of the feast called the Feast of Purim. And it's a feast that is still celebrated by Jews around the world today, just before they celebrate Passover. So we're going to read chapter 1. It's quite lengthy and it has some fun names for me to try. So will you read along on the screen with me? These events happened in the days of King Xerxes, who reigned over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Ethiopia. At the time, Xerxes ruled his empire from the royal throne in a fortress at Susa. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. He invited all the military officers of Persia and Media, as well as the princes and the nobles of these provinces. The celebration lasted 180 days. Wow. A tremendous display of opulent wealth of his empire and the pomp and splendour of his majesty. When it was all over, the king gave a banquet for all the people from the greatest to the least who were in the fortress of Susa. It lasted for 7 days, and it was held in the courtyard of the palace garden. The courtyard was beautifully decorated with white cotton curtains and blue hangings. They were fastened with white linen cords and purple ribbons to silver rings embedded in marble pillars. Gold and silver couches stood on mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. The graphic that we are using for the story of Esther over the next 4 weeks is taken from a mosaic tile that was discovered and dates back to the Persian Empire, and that's why we've used it. The drinks were served in golden goblets of many designs, and there was an absolute abundance of royal wine, reflecting the king's generosity. By edict, the king, no limits were placed on the drinking, for the king had instructed all his palace officials to serve each man as he wanted. At the same time, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. On the 7th day of the feast, when the king was in high spirits because of the wine, he told the 7 eunuchs who attended him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zetha, and Carcass, to bring Queen Vashti to him with the royal crown on her head. He wanted the nobles and all the other men to gaze on her beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman. But when they conveyed the king's orders to the Queen Vashti, she refused to come, and this made the king furious, and he burned with anger. He immediately consulted with his wise advisors, who knew all the Persian laws and customs, and he always asked for their advice. The names of these men were Karshina, Shetha, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Parsina, and Memucan, 7 nobles of Persia and Media. They met with the king regularly and were held in the highest position in the empire. What must be done to Queen Vashti, the king demanded. What penalty does the law provide for a queen who refuses to obey the king's orders properly, when they're properly sent through his eunuchs? Memucan answered the king and his nobles, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also every noble and citizen throughout your empire. Women everywhere will begin to despise their husbands when they learn what Queen Vashti has done to refuse to appear before the king. Amen. Before this day is out, the wives of all the king's nobles throughout Persia and Media will hear what the queen did and will start treating their husbands the same way. There will be no end to the contempt and anger. So if it pleases the king, we suggest that you issue a written decree, a law of the Persians and Medes that cannot be revoked. It should order that Queen Vashti will forever be banished from the presence of the king, and that the king should choose another queen more worthy than she. When this decree is published throughout the king's vast empire, husbands everywhere, whatever their rank, will receive the proper respect from their wives. The king and his nobles thought this made good sense, so they followed Memucan's counsel. He sent letters to all parts of the empire, to each province in its own script and language, proclaiming that every man should be the ruler of his own home and should say whatever he pleases. What a crazy story. It reads like a bad soap opera, doesn't it? King Xerxes was this puffed up, proud man, one of the wealthiest men in the world. But he also appears to be weak-willed. One commentary I read calls him a buffoon who is driven by a combination of alcohol and the desire for honour. He was impulsive and full of himself. Now, we have the privilege of having access to the works of the secular Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote in his book, it wasn't a book back then, but he described Xerxes as a cruel, capricious, sensual man. And that fits well with the character that we read about in the book of Esther. He was a king that could get everyone to obey him except the queen, except his wife. He was a king who depended on the advice of others to make decisions. This was the last day of the feast, and he was in good spirits because of the wine he had been drinking. And on the advice of the nobles of Persia, who must have also been at the feast, and therefore we can assume had been drinking, he made this ridiculous decree that all Persian men should be masters of their own houses and say whatever they pleased. Now, I'm not sure that any of the women of Persia would feel respected, loved, valued, or honoured by such a decree. Xerxes' wounded pride and inebriated mind led him to a rash decision and an irrevocable law. The Bible tells us in the book of Daniel 6:8, that in the Medo-Persian culture, when a law was made, even the king could not change it. In fact, it says this, an official law of the Medes and Persians cannot be revoked. So Xerxes' decree was made, verse 20. When this decree was published throughout the king's vast empire, husbands everywhere, whatever their rank, will receive the proper respect from their wives. How successful do you think a law like that would have been in engendering the proper respect? Can I suggest that it might have been able to create obedient wives or subservient wives, maybe even obedient wives with secretly bad attitudes, but not proper respect. Respect is not gained by force. Respect does not work that way. Respect is earned. We respect people who are honest, who are fair, and who are kind. And in the New Testament, Paul gives us guidelines for what love and respect should look like. 1 Corinthians 13, he says, it doesn't matter who you are. You could be a king or living on the streets. How smart you are, how many languages you can speak. It doesn't matter how many of God's words you know and understand or how much faith you have. It doesn't even matter how generous you are. If you don't love, you gain nothing. Verse 4 starts in, love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way. It is not irritable and it keeps no record of being wronged. It does not rejoice about injustice, but rejoices whenever the truth wins. Love never gives up, never loses faith, is always hopeful, and endures through every circumstance. Does any of that sound like King Xerxes? Does any of that sound like a definition of you? If we claim to follow Jesus, his Spirit is living within us. That helps us to be patient and kind and humble, but it's a journey. When we give our lives to Jesus, the Spirit of God helps to change us, but we are a work in progress. Baptism doesn't magically make Max like Jesus. It's a series of learning and falling and getting back up again. It's admitting when we're wrong and when we let God down. It's asking forgiveness from God and from our loved ones. It's an honest discussion with God about our failings, and it's asking him to help us to be more like Jesus. I respect the people who have my best interests at heart. I respect people who will treat me like 1 Corinthians 13. We will gain respect when we learn to live a life of love. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about Queen Vashti and the way she must have felt about the abuse that she received. I'm going to talk a little bit about abuse in our society, and I wanted to let you know before I started in case you're triggered by talk of abuse. Whatever her reasons for disobeying the king, Queen Vashti showed amazing strength and determination. There would have been consequences for her disobedience, and she would have understood that, but she refused to be a pawn in the drunk game of her king, her husband, and a room full of drunk men. Her example should give us great hope. Xerxes' request was a form of abuse of power. It was a command that risked exposing his queen to a bunch of drunk, debauched men. It was disrespectful of her as his wife and insulting in her position as the queen. It was disrespectful of her intelligence and an abuse of her beauty. Abuse is not limited to the king of ancient Persia. It's a growing problem in our community. Our daily news feeds are full of terrible stories about victims of abuse. And there is a growing epidemic of substance abuse. We've talked about a housing crisis and an increase in pornography, which can fuel this tragic statistic that's on the screen. 1 in 6 women and 1 in 16 men have experienced violence by an intimate partner. And that statistic is 2018. And here we are 6 years later. I wonder what it is now. We have a red bench sitting outside our office. You walk past it every Sunday as you come into worship. Red Bench is an initiative of the Red Rose Foundation, a national not-for-profit charity who works to address the damaging impact of domestic violence across our communities. Their slogan is, "Change the ending." The presence of a red bench in a public location aims to raise the awareness and provide an opportunity for this important issue to remain visible. It is a visual reminder to us that it's our God-given mandate to care for those who are vulnerable and those who have been mistreated. James 1:26 and 27 says, if you claim to be religious, but you don't have a control of your tongue, you are fooling yourself and your religion is worthless. Pure and genuine religion in the sight of God the Father means caring for orphans and widows in their distress and refusing to let the world corrupt you. Caring for orphans and widows in their distress. It's part of our responsibility if we claim to follow Jesus. And I am so grateful to be part of a church community where I know there are people who are actively caring for the vulnerable and for victims of abuse. We are working to help feed, to house, to educate and care for those who we know are suffering the effects of abuse. Abuse comes in so many different forms: physical, emotional, psychological, financial, material, modern slavery, spiritual, organisational, institutional, sexual abuse. Abuse happens in families, in schools, in workplaces, in churches, in organisations and in social settings. There are people here who are being cared for and loved and supported as they face the heartbreaking and unexpected situations that life has thrown at them. Broken homes, broken hearts, broken lives. It breaks the heart of God. And we, the church, are his vessel for change and love and support in our community. It shouldn't be something that we boast about. It is our God-given responsibility. And it's not just the responsibility of some of us, it's the responsibility of all of us. Queen Vashti's bravery set in motion the story of Esther. And that brings us to chapter 2. Xerxes comes to regret his rash decision to banish his queen, and so his wise men, yet again, suggest that he collects all the most beautiful women of his kingdom and choose himself a new queen. Esther, a young Jewish orphan, is chosen because of her beauty to parade in front of this cruel man and forced to spend a night with him. He chooses her as his next queen, and she is crowned and thrust into a position of great power and influence. Esther is an unlikely heroine, but she is God's choice. He chose her to save his people, and she changed history by her obedience and bravery. And we're going to read about that in the weeks to come. God called her to stand up for her people. What is God calling you to? You may not be able to save a nation. You are not the Queen of Persia, but you have a circle of influence. And perhaps this morning you are being challenged to step into something new. Perhaps God is prompting you to surrender to him your plans. Perhaps this morning God is showing you a bigger picture for your life. In chapter 4 of Esther, Esther's uncle Mordecai gives a challenge. And it's the words of this challenge that Lizzie, Willow and Brendan wrote their song about. It's probably the best known and most quoted passage in the book of Esther. And I'm sure you'll hear it read a few times more in the next 3 weeks. Esther chapter 4, verse 12. Don't think for a moment, because you are in the palace, that you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arrive from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. Perhaps you are here at HumeRidge today for such a time as this. Or in your current workplace for just such a time as this. Or at your school for just such a time as this. What is God saying to you today? Allow the Spirit of God freedom to speak to you as we sing this morning. Don't push him away and don't rush out to get a cup of coffee. Don't mask the voice of truth in your life because it makes you feel uncomfortable. Let's give God some time as we ponder what this first chapter of Esther has begun to uncover in our lives. Let's let the band lead us in worship, and let's let God continue to speak. Even when we don't see it, God is working. And even when we don't feel it, He's working. If we believe that He is sovereign, then we must believe that He is working in our lives, in our jobs, in our schools, in our homes. And if God has spoken to you this morning, don't go home without telling someone or praying with someone. There are people who'll come down the front and pray for you. However big or however small your needs, bring them before God this morning. Perhaps today is the day when you will surrender to the prompting of the Holy Spirit in your life. Today might just be the beginning of your journey. Our relationship with God is personal, but we journey together. And together we carry the load as we share in the highs and the lows, and as we help each other to become more like Jesus. Will you pray with me? Even now, Father God, you are working. Your Spirit is prompting us. Please give us the courage to act, the courage to move, the courage to step out. In the name of your precious Son, Jesus, who came to show us your love, who died and rose again so that we can have a relationship with you forever. Amen.